Um, it's wonderful to be joining you from Jarrah Country in central Victoria. Uh, Pop in the chat where you're joining us from so we can see who's staying up late in New Zealand, who's in Australia. Um, Someone's already popped in WA. It's not quite so late there. Um, Wonderful, and what roles we've got here, teachers and spe learning specialists, whatever your role is, pop it in there. It's great being here, and make sure you do reach out and make sure you do reach out to Rupert as well to check out Spellcaster. He might visit your school. That's how we sort of connected and uh, going there. All right, so the science of reading. Uh, it's hot topic not just in New Zealand, but definitely in Australia and in Victoria. We've had a bit of a mandates come out in the middle of last year. So I'm curious, where's your school in the science of reading journey? Zero being the science of reading is completely new, not quite sure what to do. 10 is you've got everything embedded, or maybe you're creating a structured online platform about literacy. Maybe that's a 10. Five's probably somewhere in the middle. You've got quite a few things going, but looking for somewhere else to, those next steps. If I'm being honest, probably I'd place my current school, Campbell's Creek Primary, including Guildford campus, probably we're about a 7. So I've been at the school for, this is my third year there, and they started before I joined them. It's hard work shifting our instruction. It's a hard work being in a school. Change is very difficult in the best of times, and then you have things like new teachers come on board. You've got the day-to-day dealing with students and all the other priorities that are competing. So it takes time, and it's a tricky space to manage that. So hopefully today I'll give you a few tips, share a bit of where I've gone, some of the things that we've done. This isn't the exact thing that everyone should do. These aren't the exact steps necessarily, but rather there's some useful, hopefully, tips along the way. And I'm seeing lots of a couple of zeros, twos, fives, sevens. I think sevens is about the highest I saw pop in there. Cool. So hopefully, I did see an 8, but that was the number of schools. Oh, bit of flicking there. Um, well, there we go. Start off with a bit of a wordy one. I'll give you a moment just to read through that one. Not sure why my screen's been quite so flickery today. But essentially, the science of reading is not a fixed thing up, is what I want to emphasize here. It's built on a vast body of research, but like all research, it is changing and updating and evolving. So, what I say today is not exactly the same that I would have said 3 years ago. Uh, and probably in 3 more years, I'd be saying something slightly different along the way. So, I've tried to go and make sure that we're doing some best bets, um, but also really harnessing that there is a lot of research that has gone into the science of reading. So I think we need to start talking about, well, what is reading? I'm not going to spend too long on this because I know uh, there's already a couple of great presenters in the Spellcaster series who have talked a bit about what the science of reading is. So the first framework of reading that I really like is the simple view of reading. It's not saying that reading is simple, rather it's just a simple way to look at the complexity of reading. And Goff and Tunner came up with that in 1986. And that is, we've got this element of word recognition. Sometimes that's just simplified down into phonics, but it's more than that. Um, and we've also got this concept of language comprehension. And when we combine those two factors, we end up with our reading comprehension. It's really important that we consider that as a factor, um, because if you're strong in one but really weak in another, uh, your reading comprehension is going to be affected. So if you don't know how to decode and you've got all the language comprehension skills in the world, you're not actually going to be able to read because that decoding is holding you back. You're not going to get to reading comprehension because your word recognition is holding you back. This is expanded a bit more. in The Reading Rope by Scarborough. And there's more concepts there. It's sort of language comprehension is broken down into background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge. And then our word recognition side, we've got phonological awareness, decoding, sight recognition. So a lot of those things working together to become skilled, fluent readers. Then we get to the big six, or I like to call it sometimes the pillars of reading. So we start with oral language, which a lot of our children come to school with quite a lot of oral language. Not all, some students need to absolutely a lot of teaching around that. But generally, we've got this really rich foundation of oral language. And we're trying to get our students to that reading comprehension. And so we've got some pillars here. One is phonemic awareness. We've got that phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and language comprehension. And those five pillars make up, sometimes referred to as the big five, and things like the National Reading Panel picked up on those five elements. And, the US National Reading Panel was back in 2001. Australia had one in 2005, and I think the UK's version was 2006. So we're talking about 20 years ago, where these fundamental pillars have been shown as being really important to get students to make meaning from texts that they read. I've got phonics there, but English is, of course, a morphophonemic language. And so sometimes I like to refer to that a bit more as word decoding, taking in that morphological aspect as well, as we're moving students through their skills. All right, bit of a dump there. Now we're thinking, how do I even start? The answer that I have to give is it depends. It depends on your school, it depends on your circumstances, it depends on so many different factors. One thing which is slightly frustrating sometimes is that we often have to start with baby steps. And that can be challenging because we're educators, we want what's best for our students, and we want to get there now. Um, so I'm going to show you the baby step that I started with, not at my current school, but at my previous school. And that was phonemic awareness. Now, it was in 2020 that we were really starting to introduce this. 2020 was a very interesting time for educators, but it was also a time where a lot of companies were sharing things relatively cheaply or freely. And I grabbed, it was Hegarty's Phonemic Awareness and some sample lessons and trialed that with my grade 1, 2 students. Um, Phonemic awareness is a bunch of skills, including isolating phonemes, whether it's the beginning phoneme, the end phoneme, or the middle phoneme, uh, blending the sounds in words together, segmenting, so separating the sounds. So if you've got a word like cat, being able to segment it to k, at, adding phonemes to sounds. So if you've got at, being able to add a k to make cat, and deletion, which is the opposite. You've got cat, taking away the k and being left with the at, and substituting, so changing cat to cot. Now we went, I want to say gung ho. We went with it with a bit of fidelity and saw some wonderful results with our students, and not just our very youngest students, but older students as well, recognizing that they hadn't been taught the phonemic awareness skills that they needed in order to be successful readers, but also spellers. Um, but as I've said, if I was doing this 3 years ago, my message would be a bit different. My message now is of those skills, these three are the really important ones. They're the ones where we get a lot of bang for our buck. So if we're spending our time, which is limited in the classroom, it's these three that we really want to make sure that we're addressing. Another aspect is that it is often said that phonemic awareness can be done in the dark because it's talking about the sounds in words. So you can do it in the dark, but it's better if we turn the lights on. And actually linking these to letters, to the graphemes as quickly as possible, doing these activities with the graphemes as quickly as we can and introducing the graphemes as early as possible is the best way. And it's certainly what I recommend. Also talking about how long we spend teaching these skills. We don't need 15 minutes every day doing this. Actually, we probably just need 2 minutes a day, really focusing on some of these skills. And then adding in the graphemes makes it phonics, and gives us more time to focus on some of these other areas. So, one thing we can stop doing, let's declutter some stuff. One thing we can stop doing is we can stop assuming that students will have pre-literacy skills. We can't assume that all our students will have that. Many will, but definitely not all of them. So what we can start doing is teaching phonemic awareness in short, focused sessions, linking to letters. And what we can absolutely continue is building those opportunities for oral language development. And I think that's something that schools have done really well, is making sure that we're building those rich language opportunities. So my next, so that's sort of the first steps that I took. Uh, but then my daughter's school contacted me about what steps they could take. And my daughter's school is also now my current school. So this was before I joined them. Uh, but my first thought there was, okay, let's get some consistency happening across what's going on. And we did that through building fluency and making sure that we were teaching fluency. Fluency is the bridge between that word recognition side and the language comprehension side. Uh, and when we're talking about fluency, we're talking about accuracy. We're also talking about pace. And we call that the automaticity. And we're also talking about expression or prosody. And a nice little routine that you can set up right across the school. We set it up from our foundation students, not quite yet, not in week 4 of term 1, but certainly by the end of term, they will be doing a routine that looks very similar. Right up through to our grade 6 students. And this is absolutely something you can do in secondary schools as well. And that's partner reading. All right. Sometimes it's called paired fluency, whatever you decide to call it across your school. Try and get the same name across the school, but pretty much you assign partners. Um, you know your students best. Don't leave it to chance. Make sure they know exactly who they need to read with, and it's best if they're reading with the same person for an extended period of time. Okay, so not a different person each day, because again, our instructional time's precious. We can't spend 5 minutes just working out who's each other's partner each day. So you've got a partner A, a partner B. Last year, my partners were apples and bananas, and they had those on their desks. So it was really clear who was who. They sit side by side, uh, and they read the same text, but both students should be tracking. So now working out whether or not they've got one copy of the text or 2 copies of the text, working out how that fits best with your students. Partner A reads for a set period of time, up to about 3 minutes. And we get the timer out to make sure we're very precise with the times. Preps did not start. Our 5-year-olds did not start with 3 minutes. They started with 30 seconds. And in fact, the very first time we're introducing this, I'm partner A, they're all my partner B. Together, we're doing a lot of choral response and working through it and really modeling it explicitly. Partner B listens and provides feedback. And the tricky part is we need to teach how to give your partners feedback. We can't just assume that they're going to give feedback. It's hard enough for us as teachers to give meaningful feedback. We need to make sure we're teaching our students to, teaching them to think about things that the partner is doing well, really specific things. And then they swap with partner B going back to the start of the passage. Now, again, that's one of those things that my thinking's changed a bit around. I would have said, oh, I don't really mind who, whether they go on with the reading or whether they go back to start. But I think my mind has shifted that repeated reading is underrated. So rereading the same text has huge benefits for our students and for their fluency. And so it just gives that opportunity for a repeated read. It also gives us that opportunity for on a Monday, if partner A is a slightly stronger reader, then partner B's got an extra chance of listening to that before they have a go. Um, it's really quite powerful having them go back, especially with some of our uh, weaker readers. So the thing we got rid of to make room for paired fluency was independent reading time. I love independent reading. Uh, as an adult, I read a lot by myself. But again, our instructional time is precious. And when we're doing independent reading as a whole class, there's only so many students you can ensure are using that for its fully intended purpose. So protecting our instructional time. The next thing is start fluency pairs. Um, I think I've even called it something different in my previous slide to now. So try and be consistent, unlike my slides. And the thing that you're going to continue is make sure you're continuing listening to your students, listening to them read and giving feedback. The difference is it's not in a conference where you're spending 5 or even longer minutes with one child, but actually you're going around during that 3 minutes and you're listening to students for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, depending on how long they need for you to give them a really actionable piece of feedback. So my next option for where you could start with the science of reading in your school is around developing a shared understanding of what we actually mean by explicit teaching. Because we've got lots of different ideas there, and schools need to be on board with exactly what they mean. Because everybody says they do explicit teaching, uh, but somehow it looks incredibly different in lots of different classrooms. One way that we ensured explicit teaching was shared across the school was by introducing vocabulary instruction and really explicit vocabulary instruction. Uh, Briefly on vocabulary, we can words generally fall into sort of three groups. We've got tier one words, which are really common basic words. They're frequently used, and most of our students will actually come to school knowing these words already. So words like a chair, words like run, words like happy. Then we've also got tier two words, and they can be used in a variety of different contexts. And these are words that appear across different texts. So words like pounce, words like putrid, words like interact. They've got richer meanings and the context can change depending on them. And then we've got our tier three words, which have a very specific definition. And so generally are used in just one specific context. So a tundra, adaptation, router. Um, so when we're thinking about which words to teach, because it's actually impossible to teach every single word in the English language, we're not going to start with the words that most of our students already know and currently use. And we possibly don't need to jump straight to words that have a very specific context, although that it is important to teach those in that context. If you're studying deserts, you might need the word tundra. But rather, we're going to get a lot more bang for our buck when we're looking at those tier two words, where students can use them in their narrative writing, but then they can also use them in their persuasive writing. They can use them to up-level an information text as well. Um, Often this is presented as a bit of a pyramid. I like to think of it more as a cake. We need all the layers, but they're just at different times in different ways. So we can teach vocabulary incidentally. We can teach it embedded, but more importantly, we can teach it focused or really explicitly. So the procedure we followed was that we read the word in context. So already this is coming from a text that we are reading as a whole class. So we're sort of shifting away from small groups or independent reading where everyone's reading a different text. But we're thinking about, okay, what are we doing in our novel study? What word's an important one that we want our students to understand? What are we doing in our knowledge building reading? What word here is an important one for people to understand? Then we provide a definition. Okay, instructional time is precious. So when you go, who knows what tundra means, or who knows what pounce means, You might end up with the right answer straight away in some utopian classroom that I would like to teach in. But more often than not, you get given a completely incorrect answer or an almost correct answer, which is almost just as uh, hazardous for our students. Uh, and then you go, "Ah, no, that's not quite it. Johnny, what what do you think?" And then you go, "Oh, Stevie, what do you think?" And suddenly you've heard three incorrect answers uh, in the time when you could have just given them a definition and they could have actually been practicing how to use it. What's also a bit hazardous around there is that someone who did have the correct definition but maybe didn't offer it uh, has now heard some incorrect definitions and might now be confused about what the word actually means. So please provide a definition and provide it in kid-friendly terms. Give some examples and non-examples. Have students use the word because if they're not going to use it in this teaching environment, then when it comes to their writing, they're not going to be safe. They're not going to be comfortable using that word. And the last really important step is reviewing and reusing those words so that they're really embedded in our students' memories. So 2 years ago, we came up with a term focus on vocabulary, and every class were using a slide that looked like this. Um, we were making it easy for teachers. So I created all these slides for that term before passing that on to teachers. So it was a lot of work, but we started with a context. They turned back into people dazed and confused. The definition: when something confuses you, it is hard to understand. Something about it doesn't make sense. We give examples. It confuses our dog when I tell her to come and my brother tells her to stay. I am confused why the word could has an L in it. We were also teaching that word that week. And then we were giving some picture examples as well. This one was aimed at preps. So a nice picture there of someone being a bit confused. Now, my teaching's not that magical that just after that one incident, kids have got it locked in. So we also built in a lot of review. Uh, so students would write the word that finishes these sentences. Captain Jack learnt to conserve water on his long journeys. We'd do this on mini whiteboards. In the early years, they'd just say the word. Before setting sail, Captain Jack gathered a supply of food. On a dreary day, Captain Jack longed for sunshine. So you can see there we've focused a bit more on the tier two words. We definitely still taught tier three words. And there are times when you also find that you do need to teach definitions of tier one words. But then we got that embedded across the school. And then I was able to pass the slide creation over to teaching teams. And that's a really good routine that we've got happening across the school. It's really helping teachers think about the vocabulary and the texts that they're sharing with their class and which ones they want students to use in conversation, but also in their writing. So one thing we stopped around here was small group rotations. We Marie Kondoed that and we focused much more on whole class. And for us here, it was vocabulary instruction. And that went in hand with explicit whole class read alouds. And the thing that we really need to make sure we're continuing here is bringing your passion for literacy. Now, people in Victoria, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, he's touched a little bit on that phonemic awareness thing that we're mandated to introduce, but he hasn't really spoken much about phonics yet. Well, that's it. We're up to the big one now. And the reason I didn't start with phonics is because it's a big shift for many schools. And I want to recognize that. And it's really important that we think how much teachers need to think about what they're doing to make this shift. It's certainly something that I wasn't taught at university, and I had to learn as I was teaching. And that's the case for many experienced teachers. And when we add experience into trying to change things, it becomes really complex. So that's why often don't try and start with that one because it's not the baby step to start with. It's a big one. Not calling it phonics here, but decoding needs phonics. Our students need it. And phonics is really linking letters or the graphemes with the sounds that they represent. So with the phonemes that they represent. And then later on, we start adding in layers of morphology in there as well. Uh, Analytical phonics is sort of how I was introduced to it at university. This was kind of what was taught to me a bit at university, and that is forward. Uh, we might look at a word like pin and then a word like pretty and see, they both start with the same letter and it's making the same sound. Pin and pretty. That letter's P, it's making that sound. Pig and peak all follow the same pattern. And we might then look at the word peak and we can analyze that word and go, we can see the EAK rhyme. And then I can change the P to a B and we end up with beak, or we can end up with weak. And unfortunately, we ended up with lots of weak readers going that way because there's a lot of mental gymnastics trying to work out some of those things. There's a lot of cognitive load going on. Many of our students are able to navigate that and have been able to navigate that, but not as many as we need. So that's when we get to synthetic systematic phonics or systematic synthetic phonics. We shorten it to SSP so that I don't have to remember whether the synthetic or systematic comes first. Synthetic here does not mean fake. We're not talking about synthetic turf as in fake turf. We're talking about synthetic meaning to build up. So like a synthesizer builds up sound. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking letters and in particular the sounds that they represent. So here we've got S representing a S, A representing an A, T representing a T, P representing a P, I representing an E, and N representing N. So SATPIM, which is how a lot of phonics programs start with those letters, or they might choose some slightly different ones to start with. But then once you know those 6 letters and the sounds they make, and you've got that skill of being able to blend sounds together, that phonemic awareness skill, and especially if we've linked it to letters already, then we can make the word pin. We can make the word sat. We can make the word nap. We can make the word pat. We can make the word knit, and we can make the word tap. We can make so many different words, and I'm only using 3 letters in just those words. We can start making 4-letter words and 5-letter words as well. So which one's more successful? It's that systematic synthetic phonics, really making sure that we're following that scope and sequence. And now the next question I get is, okay, so which program should I use? And the answer is, it depends. There are so many programs out there. I don't feel the need to create a new one. There are so many great programs. Some of these are free. Some of these are, I think UFly's maybe $200 for a book, which is very cheap in terms of school budgets. Some of these are a bit more expensive. Some of these, I say we don't need to create new ones, unless maybe it's a gamified, individualized version like Spellcaster. So there's lots of great phonics programs out there. The important thing probably is to start one and to be consistent and true and try and do fidelity with that one to make sure that it's working rather than just picking and choosing from a whole range of them and then never quite working out why the sequence isn't quite working. I do have the Victorian government's Phonics Plus there. That's the best symbol I could find for it. Forms is another great one. Lots of great ones there. So one thing we're going to stop doing is predictable readers or those leveled readers, those really early ones that had repetitive text. And the reason is they encourage guessing. They have phoneme grapheme correspondences that students have not been taught yet. And the reason that students appear to read those books is they're using the repetitive pattern and the picture. And that means they are thinking that reading is looking at the picture rather than the word. When we are decoding, we are looking at the word. So we're going to stop predictable readers that encourage guessing. But what we're going to start is our systematic systematic synthetic phonics programs. And we're going to use decodable readers that have the sounds, letter sound correspondences that students have been taught. So they can practice those things. Now, I'm going to give you a hot tip. They are not the world's best literature. That's not their purpose. Their purpose is to give our students the chance to practice the things that they've been taught to become more fluent. And this is going to help us continue to build a love of reading with our students. Right? Now, I haven't even touched on one side of the simple view of reading. So let's get into a bit of comprehension. And the reason I haven't touched on it is because when we're starting off, we can't change everything all at once, despite maybe our wishes sometimes. And so letting our current comprehension practices continue until we're a bit more settled with some of these other things is okay. Let's look at comprehension. What happens a lot is we focus on the skills of comprehension. So we might be analyzing the main idea. We might be looking for inference and practicing inference. And then they came up at the same time. Uh, that's contrasted with knowledge building um, and using comprehension to build knowledge. And I did have a pendulum there, and I think I haven't put it back in. But it's not a pendulum swing. What happens is we can use texts that build knowledge as a pathway to teach the skills. So rather than looking at a range of isolated texts that all help us look for the main idea, or a bunch of different texts that all have a good little passage to use a bit of inference with, let's look at a novel. And then when there's a bit that we need to identify the main idea, we do that with our students. And then in the next chapter or paragraph, when we need to use a bit of inference, let's highlight that and use that as the tool to teach inference. So we're using the rich text to drive the skills that we are teaching. So we absolutely still need to teach comprehension skills and strategies, but we're building knowledge consciously along the way. So we do that through novel studies, and we also do that through, we use a lot of core knowledge texts, and so we now call it core knowledge, but we're also drawing on other knowledge-rich texts. So the thing we're going to stop is reading those isolated texts for comprehension skills. We're going to start building knowledge through rich texts, making sure we're using fiction and non-fiction texts. And we're going to continue reading to our students. Okay. I'm walking in classes across my school and other schools and love listening. Teachers bring texts alive to their students. Let's talk about assessments. In Victoria, we just got rid of, or we're getting rid of the English online interview. So a lot of people are going, well, what do we do here? Now, if predictable texts aren't useful, then it makes sense that those level texts may not be the best assessment tool to use if that's not what we're teaching with. And in fact, this study in 2000 and was published in 2015, looked at Francis and Pennell and their benchmarking assessment system, and they found that the accuracy of that assessment was about as good as flipping a coin, about 50%. So many students were falling behind or falling through the gaps because they weren't being identified as being at risk in reading. Now, I've done lots of running records. In fact, I'm pretty sure a fair chunk of one uni subject was being able to do a running record. And at my previous school, for one assessment period, in fact, for a couple of assessment periods, I think I assessed the whole school in running records. So I've got a lot of experience with running records and know how long they take, and then know how long it then takes to retest a student. So if I'm spending that long with students, I want the assessment to be accurate. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop assessing with tools that promote three queuing or multi-queuing, so that MSV, because of those, probably the most important one is the visual of what the letter or letters are, and then linking that to our knowledge of phonics and morphology to read the whole word. And we're going to start using reliable screeners for assessment. So Dibbles or Acadience or Cubed DDM, I think it's dynamic decoding measures, um, or cubed narrative language measures as well, um, to really get a reliable picture of where our students are. The great news about these screeners, many are free, and they also take a fraction of the time. And the thing that we're also going to continue is reporting against your curriculum standards. Because there was a bit of a thing that when we were assessing using benchmark, um, running record things would go, oh, they're a level D or an E. That means that they're at the end of prep. Or their level, I think PM benchmark was level 15 was the end, oh, they're at the end of grade one. And we would skip the step of going and actually looking at what our curriculum is saying students should be capable of to get that result. So we really need to make sure we are continuing looking at what our curriculum standards are because that's what we are reporting against. Bit of Shannon Knoll there just to show my age. This is the science of reading, but we can't forget about writing. Okay. So we need to make sure that we are also thinking about the writing. Now, the other thing is writing's possibly not going to be your first step. Uh, but here's a few steps of writing that I think are underrated. So I thought I'd mention them right now. One is making sure that we're teaching handwriting. And the great news about lots of phonics program is that they explicitly teach handwriting as letters are introduced. So really making sure that we are teaching handwriting and not just in the first year of school, but right through school. Another thing that's a bit underrated is dictation, and that's not my stance on what the teacher should be like in the classroom, but giving students a sentence that you know that they've got the skills to write and then practicing. It reduces a lot of cognitive load in what is writing is a really tricky task, and we're giving them something that they can write and write comfortably and practice there. And we're linking our dictation and our handwriting because if we're reducing some of the cognitive load, we can make sure that they're focusing that bit more on handwriting. And the other really big one, it's sort of like the phonics of writing in my mind, is that sentence level writing. So really making sure we're using those sentence levels things as building blocks in what we're doing. And doing a lot of work in sentence level writing. And that's not to say we're completely scrapping your genre writing. That's still important, but we need to also make sure we're getting those sentences really well crafted. So what we have stopped doing is just assigning writing. That here's 45 minutes, go and write a narrative about this picture. We do it occasionally, but it's more of an assessment at that point in time. What we've really started doing and making sure that we're teaching all the little skills that go into crafting that full text and really thinking about all those mechanical skills as well as those authorial skills that craft a rich text and building up to that. And the thing that we really want to continue is creating passionate writers. Now, it's taken me a bit to learn a lot, and I'm still learning so much. Uh, but what I've got here are just some of the resources that I've used along my way. Probably could have had another slide just of podcasts that I listen to as well. But these are a few books that are really great reads. Um, yeah, wonderful reads that you should add to your library. And as I flick off to the next one, don't worry because that QR code and that link should take you to a copy of the PDF here. So you should be able to jump on, have a look at those slides, go back to those resources. But thank you for your time. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, James. What a sort of concentrated burst of just such helpful, like practical skills and your knowledge. And you can just some of that fine-grained things in terms of the bang for the buck just speaks to things you can only really pick up by, I think, doing it and sort of feeling it in the classroom and going, okay, this work has worked initially, but let's layer some other things in or adjust it slightly. So that sort of, I suppose, chiropractic work is so helpful and such a boost, I think, or a level up for people who may be beginning the journey and say, okay, I can skip a step or move to this part where James has said to start. And maybe that's a good place rather than having to do all the learning themselves. So thank you for sharing all of that. We've got some time for questions, and there's some great feedback coming through. I think you've really, hit the nail on the head, James, with your advice and guidance. But there's two questions here from Fern, so I might just kick off I'll just run them both to you, James. So one is, what would you recommend doing if you are implementing Hegedy? And then the second question is there a writing program that you recommend?
Right. And that first one is a great one because of course we introduced Haggerty, and then I went, actually, it's probably something here that's not quite working. But thinking that change management kind of thing, you then can't just be like, stop all that work that we've done. And in fact, there's lots of Haggerty that's really great. And in fact, I think their newer versions incorporate graphemes much sooner. So I think they introduced a new version, maybe 2022, that some of my hesitation with it has been eliminated. But what we're doing with our Hegedy is we're trying to make sure that we are introducing graphemes as much as possible. So instead of just saying segmenting a word orally, we'll also go and write that word on our whiteboards. Um, so it becomes phonics then. Um, the other thing we're doing is just reducing the number of activities that we're doing with it so that we're reducing the time that it takes each day. Um, a lot of other phonics programs, so if you're starting that way, already have those phonemic awareness skills built in. So I'm not saying throw Hegedy phonemic awareness out the window tomorrow, but think about how you can up level that. And I think that's a really important one across this. Like, don't try and go and do all of this tomorrow. This has taken my current school 3, 4 years to do, um, and we're still working on it. Now, the second question about writing programs, um, we use the Writing Revolution as a framework, but we've also complemented that with Story Champs, which teaches sort of a more narrative structure. So we find the Writing Revolution really powerful for sentence level, but also for building non-fiction texts. And then we complement that with Story Champs for the fiction texts. So that's what we're using. I also know there's things like the Syntax Project from Oka, which we use a bit as well, because we try and embed it as much with the uh, novel studies and comprehension that we're reading as well.
Thanks, James. Thanks for the question, Fern. There's a couple more questions coming through. So this one's from Chelsea. Should teachers still be reading decodables with students in small groups or stick to whole class reading and fluency pairs?
Okay. There's probably a little bit of clarification needed. I don't think that I, as a teacher, very rarely read aloud the decodable because it's not for me to read aloud, it's for our students to practice. Occasionally, I might model a decodable bit, but really, I want the students to be reading to that. Um, Again, it depends. There's my SpongeBob. I think if you're in a uh, prep to grade 3 class, then you might need to have a lot more small groups going on. But if you've got a class that are more similar, then you're still able to differentiate. And for me, it comes back to that instructional time. So really trying to make sure that I'm giving students as much access to me as possible because that's the opportunity I can give them feedback. And the more I can do whole class, the more I can do that. Um, that so there's a bit of a it depends answer there. You can still have small groups. I'd question how much small groups we need in prep. Last year, I had students at quite different levels. We're using Little Learners Love Literacy. Some students by the end of prep were reading beyond level 7.5. Other students were still sort of level 5, level 6 independently reading. So there's quite a bit of breadth there because they get to level 7 and then there's sort of 5 levels of that. Um, but we were still able to adjust things so that it looked like everyone was doing about the same thing, but we strategically partnered two people who were reading similar levels. Um, yeah.
Thanks, James. There was a clarification.
Chelsea, follow up on
Yeah,
that
yeah.
if you
Oh, there's a follow-up.
didn't quite up.
Chelsea did say, sorry, I mean listening to students reading in small groups.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Amy has a question. What would be your recommendation for how to allocate all parts of literacy across the week, thinking more about senior schools?
Um, that's a great question. And I have done a presentation for some sharing best practices about that. Um, and exactly that divvy up. But very quickly, our senior school, we have about 20 to 25 minutes of spelling mastery. We have a novel study or a core knowledge sort of read aloud, uh, along with vocabulary linked to that, which takes probably about another 25 minutes um, to half an hour. We have some sentence level stuff, fluency pairs, and then a bit more genre kind of writing. So that's sort of roughly how it's divvied up in that senior year level. And we never have quite enough time to fit everything in.
Thanks. Thea has two questions. I don't recall if we've already mentioned this, but could you please give some examples of the type of feedback that partners can give each other during fluency pairs? For older learners, would it be beneficial for partners to ask each other comprehension questions as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Double-barreled one. So generally, when we're teaching them how to give feedback, it's things that we're noticing in our class that we want them to focus on. So it might be you've just taught exclamation marks. So maybe they're giving their partner feedback on the fact that they spoke in a louder voice because they saw the exclamation mark. Um, or it might be as simple as, I like the way you sounded out that word. It could even be as simple as, I like the way you asked me what that word was because you weren't sure. But really thinking about the skills that we want our students to do and practice, and that we've also modeled so that they can do those things. Maybe it's putting on a different voice when they see talking marks. Um, and that comprehension question, um, I I don't think so because we're dealing with the comprehension at different times. I mean, it could be beneficial. For me, it would be that time factor. It's probably easier for me as the teacher to ask some comprehension questions about what we've read together in class on that bit rather than the text that they were just reading together. Um, there's a fair bit of load for a student to be able to ask a student a comprehension question and then consider whether or not the answer was actually an expected answer or an acceptable answer. It's hard enough as teachers sometimes to do that.
For sure. Thanks, Thea, for the questions. I've got a question, James. I'm just curious about how you manage sort of tier two and tier three learners. So that's sort of RTI stuff, if you sort of do much of that at your school. And yeah, just if you talk a bit about your process and practice around that.
Yeah. So I suppose we're fortunate we've got lots of really wonderful education support staff. So we've also been upskilling them. So because um, often they walk in without a lot of training uh, or with zero experience in the classroom. And so it's up to us to upskill them so that they can start working with small groups or individual students. Last year in the prep classroom I was at, our ES, in amongst all the other things that he was doing, he would pull kids out and listen to them read one on one. And he wrote amazing notes. And I'm just thinking I've still got a copy of the book where he would write about, the little difficulties each child read. So it just gave every child that opportunity to be heard. Um, and he would listen to them read. Um, the students who needed the most practice, he'd listen to every day. And then there'd be other students who he'd listen to maybe once a week. Um, so that was sort of trying to think about how we're strategic about our resources to get that tier two support. And I know that's one-on-one, so it's tier three-ish as well. We've also got the tutor learning initiative. So they work with groups of students. And this year, what we're trying to do with those groups is we're trying to really make them short term. So every half term, we're now looking at who's in those groups and um, so that we can increase the intensity. They're seeing the tutor 3 times a week. Um, and then I think we're about to come to the point where we're reassessing them, seeing which ones can go back to their class with a bit of tier two support and which ones need that extra um, intense intervention and which other students we can invite into that. And then probably some of those students next term will get another dose of that. But it's all such a juggling act with the resources that your school has. Um, it might also be that students are doing a more independent activity so that the teacher can pull down a few students and be really strategic with which students they're working with in the classroom. So there's all sorts of yeah, ways that it can work.
Thank you. We've got a few more minutes, so if there's any other questions that people have burning, boring a hole in their brain, please do throw it in the chat, or if there's anything else. Give some wait time. Cool. All right. Well,
Oh, sorry, Rupert. And in
yeah.
that question as well, we're starting to use this program called Spellcaster just to give students who that extra practice that they might need um, in a one-on-one sort of setting.
Oh, thanks. Excellent. I'm glad to hear that. And yeah, I'm very, very passionate about Spellcaster, and I appreciate you mentioning it. It's definitely follows the approach through that morphophonemic nature of our language. Well, if people are interested in learning more, please do reach out. But I'd love to just, say thank you, James. I know you've got laying the foundations and you're working with some schools already in terms of supporting their sort of practice and their shift and journey on the science of learning. So there's a question, one more question. So, what might these pillars look like across the curriculum in a junior secondary classroom? Oh, that's an interesting one. And I don't, James, you might have an answer to that, but I know you're sort of mainly primary focused. But yeah, any thoughts on that before we wrap up?
Look, I am mainly primary focused. I think there's a lot of similarities. Like kids in grade six and kids in grade seven are only, 6 weeks away from one another. But obviously, you've got a factor of that time issue when you've got just 45-minute sessions and so on. I think definitely thinking about the things that you can do whole class. And I'd love to see lots of continued novel studies and things like that, where the writing's really deeply interwoven with what the reading um, aspect is. And you can definitely still teach that explicit vocabulary.
Thanks, James. Yes. And look, there's a talk by Mel Henry, who's doing her PhD research in secondary level interventions with structural literacy. And she was my instructional coach back in Melbourne as well. So I'd recommend it's on our the Spellcaster blog. So check it out if you're interested in a bit more of a deep dive in terms of the secondary space, because I know it's a particularly unique challenge. But yes, having said all that, yeah, I just want to say a big, big thank you to James. For his talk tonight. Such just a tour de force of all the aspects of the main beats of structural literacy and the science of reading, and in such a sort of concise and clear, and practical manner. So thank you so much, James. Do reach out to James through Instagram, obviously through Twitter, through laying the foundations. And yeah, would love to just stay in touch with James and reach out if you have any more questions. So we'll say, I think, good night and yeah, good luck with everything this term and with everyone's journey. And do stay in touch. It's great to be building the community of people here. And yeah, thanks again, James.
Thanks, everyone.